Wild Hearts is a brand new hunting game that looks to offer its own unique twist on the genre, and of course by the genre I mean Monster Hunter. They are making their own spin on Monster Hunter. Although the game does have two immediately distinguishing characteristics, the setting being fantasy feudal Japan, and its use of this ancient tech to assist in hunts with all sorts of crazy contraptions called karakuri. This game was first teased in early September when EA revealed they were partnering with Koei Tecmo to make the next great AAA hunting game, and then last week we got the big reveal. Wild Hearts has apparently been in development for 4 years and is being made by Omega Force, the studio behind Dynasty Warriors and Tokiden. And then just today they released 7 minutes of gameplay footage showing off the various stages of a full hunt, and frankly it looks pretty sick, honestly. Like, this is a new upcoming hunting game. Took me by surprise and is surprisingly great looking. So today I want to dive into everything that I could scrounge up about what we know so far. Okay, so the basic premise of Wild Hearts is this. We play as hunters, visitors in the lands of Azuma, tasked with tracking down and eliminating kimono, massive creatures fused with the environment and capable of reshaping their surroundings, which is a really cool additional feature of this game. These monsters basically summon things up, trees and roots and all sorts of things, rocks and hurling stuff. It's pretty cool. To deal with these, we will not only be using our weapons with gameplay that looks like a relatively standard third-person action combat game, but also that ancient karakuri technology, these highly flexible tools that are said to open up all sorts of creative approaches to hunting. I'll dive into some of the various variations that we've seen, but basically these are contraptions you build on the fly that assist with things like your movement, controlling the enemy in the battlefield, and attacking the bosses outright. So that is the elevator pitch for Wild Hearts. Now let's talk some of the specifics, which a lot of this information we got from interviews, but also the trailers. So in that very first trailer, they were basically showing various bits of gameplay kind of chopped up from scene to scene. We saw a few different bosses, all of which are covered and fused with natural elements. Think like vines and rocks, flowers, roots, ice. So we saw this large rat who could spin his tail and summon in a big tree. There was a rock ape. We saw the boar, which slams the ground and summons up roots. There was also the ice wolf. And at the very end of the teaser trailer, they showed this very oversized, like, world boss. Probably something you don't fight directly, but maybe there's a level where you have to engage with it in some sort of way, like shooting stuff at it probably. And there was a brief glimpse as well of a flying boss. In addition to these bosses, we saw several small creatures like rabbits and other woodland style creatures. And again, like the bosses, these have some nature infused within them. Beyond the bosses, we got a good look in that first trailer at the karakuri, the building. Now again, these look to be probably either consumable or cooldown abilities that you place in the world, and they will serve several functions, most of which will construct a small pillar and then give you some utility. Like we saw a jumping pad, we saw helicopter wings, there was this spring-loaded hammer, a time bomb, as well as a ballista hook, which appears to be used to kind of control and tie a boss down. And a couple other things that I noticed in that first trailer included coming up on this monster but by crouching and moving through a field, so maybe there's some element of surprise or stealth in the game. And we saw a couple different weapons in the trailer. There was an umbrella, of various swords, as well as the use of bows, and loads and loads of these different armors, all with that feudal Japan inspiration, which all look pretty cool. So that trailer was just a couple minutes long, and again, it was mostly brief clips. The gameplay trailer, which just came out, really gave us a lot more information and showcased a bit more about what we can expect from the game. So they released, it was 7 minutes of gameplay total. It was actual gameplay, but HUDless, so we don't really get an idea of what the UI looks like, but this is clearly the game running and being played. And it was basically a highlights reel of an entire hunt with the player tracking and taking down the King Tusk boss, which is basically that giant boar all covered in roots and stuff. So the trailer opened up with a shot showing the player walking on a grassy cliff. We see some smaller wildlife here with this snake-looking creature. And then at the cliff's edge, they summon the helicopter karakuri, presumably to get down without taking fall damage, or just because it looks cool. I'm not sure if there's fall damage or not, but this was a cool thing to showcase. And then when they're at the bottom, they summon another karakuri. This one launches a rope at a nearby rock formation, and then they zip line up it. This is super cool. Now, it was stated in some interviews that these karakuri will be used for world traversal, like we're seeing here in addition to being used in fights. So it seems we can expect using these karakuri to get around while tracking the boss down beyond just when we're fighting them. Atop the cliff, they summon one of the jumping pads and then they grab and scale the side of that cliff. So it does look like we're going to have some environmental scaling in the game. That is neat. And also, while here, I do just want to briefly point out we've got some pretty low resolution looking textures on this terrain. This is certainly not a deal breaker, but it could play into sort of the larger picture of where we should place our expectations with this game overall. I will touch on what I mean with that in a bit. I'm not saying it's going to be a bad game, but maybe there should be an expectation bar for the scale and the fidelity overall. And I'll mention why very shortly. But overall, again, this thing is looking cool. Let's dive back into the trailer though. So the player pulls himself up and then we see in all of its glory the King Tusk boss grazing in a field of flowers and very annoyed that he's been disrupted. And then a very Monster Hunter fight ensues. You got the big boss flailing around and trying to crush or run over the player. They spend a lot of time dashing about, attacking, getting in attacks when they can, and then also using an array of the karakuri. We see the jumping pad to try to reach and slash at weak points. The boss for a moment summoned up these roots. I'm not sure if these just impede movement or if they actually do damage, but either way, cool to see. We saw a few different combo attacks and even an elemental attack with the sword glowing all of a sudden. There was also these dash pads to quickly propel in a given direction. And then the player just gets splatted, run over, and dies. We then have a scene change and the player's in a new location. He sees the boss running across this vine bridge in the distance, and then player 2 spawns in. She has with her this umbrella weapon, which is pretty cool looking. They then, in the river, take out this mud bloat toad, which they harvest from, getting several resources. The expectation here is that these are used for the game's in-game crafting system, probably consumables, maybe even towards armors and weapons. They run through some wooded corridors and we see what look to clearly be these harvestable nodes, either rocks or ores. Player 2 summons another one of those zip lines and both players follow this glowing trail towards the boss's new location. So it seems pretty clear here, like in Monster Hunter, the bosses are likely to be roaming around as they move through different phases or just as they get bored and want to go to new locations. And it is here that the fight continues in what appears to be a relatively confined arena. It's surrounded by these rock walls as well as some broken down buildings with a tree in the middle, and more Monster Hunter style fighting. The boss is thrashing around. We see some more flashy attacks from both players. I never knew that an umbrella could be such a cool looking weapon, but yes, this thing looks sick. We see some more karakuri use as well. We get a look at that spring loaded hammer, which is cool, probably does big damage. The main player also summons in what looks to be a barricade, like this reinforced wall that the boss was charging towards and then gets put into a down state once it hit it. At which point player 2 uses the helicopter to fly towards the down boss and with a big slash takes off one of its tusks. There's a little glow from the tusk as it sits on the ground, which likely means it is lootable or harvestable. And after this point, King Tusk then enrages, moving on to a new phase, glowing the bright red, and also a third player joins the fight. And that is the cap, by the way. They have mentioned in interviews that this is 3-player co-op instead of Monster Hunter's traditional 4-player groups, of which they stated that this is largely due to the use of karakuri. They felt that with 4 players, each having their own structures built, it was just too much. And also, we see in this trailer that structures can be used by players. Some of these will stay for a duration of time. So I could imagine 4 players with all of the structures they're summoning in could be a lot. But either way, yes, this game has 3-player co-op. And then this was really sick. Player 3 summons in one of the time bomb kategories, and as it is ticking down, he loads up an attack, and right before the thing explodes, he strikes it. That appears to launch it into the boss right as it pops, basically. They then continue a few more attacks. We see some visible indications that the boss is taking damage, and this was happening throughout the fight. As it took damage, like bits and pieces would fall off. It would have more slashes, more exposed skin, things like that. After it goes down for the final time, it is finished off with a cinematic shot. I don't know if this is how it's actually going to go or if that's just for the sake of this trailer, but either way. And overall, I would say this gameplay trailer was really cool. I like to see kind of bits and pieces of a hunt. Also, though, I will say that the boss moveset appeared kind of small from what they showcased here. Now, this could be an early boss. Typically in these style of games, earlier bosses will be less complex with less moves and phases and all of that. But beyond like charging and just thrashing around, we saw a couple of different body slams, some tail swipes, a few side shuffles. I hope to see a lot more of that environmental based stuff that we got a tease at in the first trailer, with them like summoning in things or spreading out large roots. I mean, they even showed the boar boss at one point having huge roots that spread a large distance. So I hope to see more of that, because that stuff is a really cool element of this game that they're making. I do also want to point out that overall in the trailer, it appeared like the gameplay space was rather linear between the arenas that they were fighting the bosses in, but also like these various small and tight corridors that they were moving through. Originally, I had thought that this game was going to be open world, but it appears like that is not the case. In an interview with IGN, the developer specifically says, Wild Hearts uses a zone-based system, which we believe has significant advantages in a hunting game in which players repeat hunts. Each separate zone is a large area, and players can reach almost any point in a zone using Karakuri, so it is possible to enjoy it like an open world game in which you actively explore the world. But no, it's not actually an open world game with a ton of zones interconnected. It appears from this quote, and also from what we saw, that you will load into the plains zone or the forest zone or whatever, however they distinguish them, and they are their own confined experiences. Now, the Karakuri stuff is really cool, between like the jumping pads, the fact that you can mantle onto terrain, the zip lines that you can just create. I don't know if you can hook those anywhere that you can see. If so, that's pretty cool. Like, that's a lot of freedom, even if it is within these zones. But this sort of does lead me into the next bit when it comes to, I guess, where we should set our expectations with this title in comparison to other hunting games, in comparison to specifically, let's say, Monster Hunter World. So one thing worth noting is that this is an EA Originals title. And I think for that reason alone, we should temper expectations when it comes to just how maybe big the game could be. And I mostly say that because EA Originals, their stated goal of this like publishing arm of EA, is to deliver unique and memorable gaming experiences to our players from the best independent studios. So these are publishings through EA of indie studios, of indie games. And, well, what have they done so far? Notable games that have been published so far under EA Originals include It Takes Two, Unravel, Lost in Random, and A Way Out. Those are probably the four biggest ones. And these are all relatively small games. Now, that doesn't mean they're bad. They are not bad games. In fact, most of these are pretty critically acclaimed. They're just not massive in scale, in scope, in fidelity even. Now, in one developer interview, they did touch on what we should expect from Wild Hearts in terms of the game's length. It was said that the main story would take players roughly 30 hours, and then to min-max would take roughly 100 hours. Now, what I'm not sure of is what exactly min-max means in this particular example. Like, are we talking about fully upgrading and gearing our character and maxing them out in 100 hours? Or does min-max just refer to doing all of like the main and the side objectives that will take 100 hours? So I will be curious to see kind of what this game delivers in terms of replayability when compared to traditional Monster Hunter games, which for a lot of people, they can easily sink hundreds, if not thousands of hours into. Monster Hunter World is one of those games where people easily clock in over 1,000 hours. And it's really going to boil down to mostly how the gear grind is presented, the upgrading system, the various sets and things that you're chasing, the long-term progression, and then also what kind of variation do they deliver in boss fights? Like, are they mixing up King Tusk fights with different elements, different affinities, different locations where you fight him? Or is the King Tusk fight always the King Tusk fight and always in the same location? That is something we just don't know as of yet. And also, when it comes to EA's involvement in this game, it is worth noting that as an EA original title, it has traditionally been the case that they've been fairly hands-off. So if you're concerned, if you don't like EA, it might not be that big of a concern, honestly. In fact, Koei Tecmo's vice president has said as much, basically stating that EA is just working to support the publishing, to help with funding, and to get this game out to the larger global market. They're not so much controlling the monetization. And speaking of which, in another interview, they said that they have no plans to offer any in-game purchases at release. That last part, it's a notable addition to that sentence. Speaking of release, this game's actually coming out really soon, even though we just learned about it. It looks like Wild Hearts is scheduled to launch on February 17th, 2023. So just a few months away, really. And yeah, I mean, I think this looks really good. And in general, I just want to say, I do think it's good that we're getting more hunting style games. Monster Hunter is massively successful. Given how successful this is and how much people like this formula and the style of game, this gameplay loop, we haven't really seen a ton of attempts at this formula. Most most recent example would be something like Dauntless, although that kind of more or less came and went. I haven't seen a lot of excitement or discussion about it much at all in the past year or so. But also, I don't think we should forget that the company making Wild Hearts has also made Monster Hunter style games before. Notably, their series Tokiden is like Monster Hunter, Japanese themed. And if you're curious, why isn't this just another Tokiden? They're taking this new approach and releasing under like a new IP and a new framework because as part of their desire to reach a larger audience and get more players interested in the series. And apparently they felt that following the Tokiden series wasn't going to do it, so they're presenting something new. And I think it's a good looking something new. Again, my biggest question right now, and maybe the biggest potential concern, would be the overall scale of the world, the levels, but scale of the overall game and how much replayability, because this is a type of game that people like to sink hundreds and thousands of hours into. They like getting those different sets, chasing those different monsters, going for that different long-term progression. If 100 hours, that min-maxing number, if that was referring to, that is like you have every set, every weapon, and they're maxed out. That's going to be on the smaller scale for what some people would expect from the series. But either way, even if it is a smaller scale game, it looks pretty sick. I mean, and again, it is cool to see a new hunting style title coming out. So I'm looking forward to this. I really like what I've seen so far, and I'm excited to learn more and play it in a few months, evidently. That's going to do it for today. Thank you guys, as always, for watching. Hope you enjoy the video. I'll see you next time.